2:32 p.m., Honolulu, Hawaii, screams echo inside the Blaisdell Arena. An elephant, massive, blood-streaked, is charging through the circus ring. Spectators scramble for exits. A man lies motionless beneath her feet. His name is Allen Campbell. He was Tyke's trainer. Minutes ago, he stood in that ring with confidence. Now he's dying in it. Outside, police radios crackle. Tyke is loose. She's heading for downtown. What triggered the breakdown of a 9,000-pound performer? And why was no one prepared? This isn't just a story about a rogue elephant. It's a story about captivity, denial, and the violent price of a broken system. It was supposed to be just another show. A humid Saturday afternoon in Honolulu. Hundreds of families filed into the Neil Blaisdell Center for the Circus International, expecting wonder, laughter, and the thrill of the exotic. Children clutched popcorn. Parents checked their watches. The program promised a parade of tigers, clowns, and elephants. For many, the highlight would be Tyke, an enormous African elephant billed as the gentle giant. She'd been trained to bow, dance, and raise her trunk to the roar of applause. What the audience didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that beneath the makeup, beneath the illusion of harmony between man and animal, something had been unraveling for years. Because no matter how many routines Tyke had rehearsed, she was still a wild animal. No matter how many performances she completed without, and no matter how seasoned Allen Campbell was, no matter how much he believed in discipline, compassion, or expertise, he was still human, still breakable. This is the paradox of the circus, the presentation of total control in a setting built on tension. An elephant doesn't perform because it loves to. It performs because it's been made to. With repetition, with discipline, with pain when necessary. But what happens when that control fails? What happens when the audience sees not the illusion, but the truth? That's what this story is about. Not just a death, not just a rampage, but the slow, invisible fracture of trust between man and animal, stage and spectator, reality and performance. In that arena, people came to see a miracle, but what they witnessed instead was a system coming apart in real time. This wasn't chaos out of nowhere, it was consequence. And it's important we understand that, because when an animal finally snaps, the damage doesn't begin in that moment, it begins long before. In every decision, every warning ignored, every dollar made at the cost of silence. He wasn't alone. The industry believed it too, until 2:32 p.m., and by then it was far too late. Allen Campbell wasn't a stranger to elephants. By the time he stepped into the ring that August day, he had already logged decades working with some of the world's largest land mammals. He was more than just a trainer. He was a specialist. One of the few people in the United States considered an expert in the handling and behavior of captive elephants. Born in the early 1950s, Campbell came up in a world where wild animals were admired, but rarely understood. He studied them with intensity, traveled to Africa, learned their habits, believed in bonding with them rather than simply breaking them. And yet, he worked in a system built on domination. He wasn't a zookeeper, he wasn't a conservationist, he was a circus trainer. For years, he trained elephants for entertainment, teaching them to pirouette, kneel, balance on stools. Behind the scenes, this often meant using tools like bullhooks and electric prods, even if Allen reportedly preferred softer methods. He often said that elephants responded best to respect, but what counts as respect in an industry that chains wild animals for hours a day? He wasn't naive. In fact, Allen had a reputation for working with difficult elephants, animals other trainers refused to handle. He'd been injured before, nearly crushed, but he kept coming back. Some say it was ego, others say it was love. The truth may be somewhere in between. He believed in control, but he also believed in relationship. He didn't see himself as a jailer, but as a caretaker. And in Tyke, he saw a challenge. She was powerful, sensitive, unpredictable, and like all elephants, she never forgot. He had only been working with her for a few months, flown in to help manage her escalating aggression. Some say he was making progress. Others say it was a powder keg waiting to blow. What's clear is this: Allen Campbell wasn't a villain, but he was part of a system that demanded obedience from creatures that were never meant to give it. On August 20th, 1994, he walked into that ring believing he had Tyke's trust. But trust, once broken, is hard to recover. And elephants remember everything. Tyke wasn't born in captivity. She was born wild, in Mozambique, most likely, in the mid-1970s, during a time of intense elephant poaching across southern Africa. At just a few months old, she was taken from her herd, likely after her mother was killed. She was one of thousands of calves exported during this era, part of a pipeline that turned wild animals into performers. By the time she arrived in the United States, she was already owned by the Hawthorne Corporation, an Illinois-based supplier of circus elephants. Her life from then on was one of confinement, compliance, and constant movement. Tyke never roamed more than a few dozen feet without a chain. She lived in boxcars, trailers, and arena basements. She performed hundreds of times for traveling circuses, sometimes twice a day. Her trainers rotated. Her food was rationed. Her rest was conditional. In place of a herd, she had strangers. In place of freedom, she had routine. Circus life doesn't mimic the wild. It replaces it with obedience. Elephants are intelligent, emotionally complex creatures. They form lifelong bonds, grieve their dead, and require constant mental stimulation. In the wild, they walk up to 30 miles a day. In captivity, they pace in place, sway, lunge, develop psychological scars. Tyke's early record was filled with incidents. Attempts to flee, signs of distress, refusals to perform. Her file was stamped again and again with behavioral red flags. But instead of being retired, she was shipped to another venue, another city, another handler. Each time the risk grew. In 1993, just a year before the Honolulu attack, Tyke had escaped from another arena during a performance in North Dakota. She broke through a door and ran through the parking lot. That time, they caught her before anyone was hurt. The warning signs were loud and clear. She was deteriorating. She was not safe. Still, she kept performing. Because Tyke was no longer seen as a being, she was a contract, an asset, a line item in a traveling show built on repetition and denial. And on August 20th, 1994, the world she knew, the one made of leashes and commands, finally collapsed. She didn't just run, she erupted. Before she ever set foot in that Honolulu arena, Tyke had been screaming for help, not with words, but with behavior. Her documented history goes back nearly a decade. Starting in the mid-1980s, USDA inspection reports and internal circus documents began to show a pattern. Tyke was difficult, resistant, unpredictable. She balked at handlers, refused commands, lunged at trainers, escaped containment more than once. In the circus industry, this was called temperamental. In the wild, it would be called trauma. One of the earliest serious incidents occurred in 1988. During a performance in Altoona, Pennsylvania, Tyke suddenly charged off stage mid-act. Witnesses said she threw her rider and nearly trampled a stagehand. Hawthorne downplayed it. Then came Minot, North Dakota, 1993. Tyke escaped through an arena door during a show, ran into the parking lot, and had to be wrangled by multiple handlers. Local news called it a minor scare. But insiders were alarmed. Trainers began quietly requesting not to work with her. Some described her as edgy, defensive, ready to blow. One former handler said, "Tyke didn't trust anyone, not anymore." Still, Hawthorne Corporation kept her on the road. Because each time she acted out, the narrative was the same. Isolate her, calm her, try again. Even just weeks before the Honolulu show, Tyke had a violent outburst during training. She slammed a gate, refused a command, and reportedly lashed out at another elephant in close quarters. But no formal incident report was filed. There was a performance to prepare for. What's more disturbing is this. Tyke's record wasn't unique. Many elephants under Hawthorne's care showed signs of mental and physical stress. In 2004, 10 years after Tyke's death, the USDA revoked the company's license and ordered the surrender of its remaining elephants due to chronic violations. But in 1994, nothing stopped her from being shipped to Hawaii. Allen Campbell, brought in to manage her, was aware of her past. He believed he could gain her trust. That his style, calm, assertive, measured, would work where others failed. But trust isn't just earned. It must be possible. And for Tyke, after years of ignored trauma, that possibility may have already been gone. The signs weren't just there, they were screaming. The Neil Blaisdell Center was no stranger to spectacle. Built in the 1960s, the multi-purpose arena had hosted everything from Elton John concerts to college basketball tournaments. But on August 20th, 1994, it became a circus, literally. The Circus International had arrived in Honolulu, complete with tigers, acrobats, clowns, and elephants. By mid-morning, the crew was already inside, unloading props, checking lights, feeding animals. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust, popcorn, and anxiety. Tyke had acted up earlier that week. She was restless, pacing, unresponsive to commands. But the show had to go on. The ring was set. A single layer of rope separated the audience from the animals. Beneath the big top lights, Tyke waited in a holding area with 2 other elephants. Allen Campbell, wearing a crisp white shirt and mic'd for performance, was slated to lead the act. With him was Dallas Beckwith, a 19-year-old elephant groom with only a year of experience. The crowd filed in. Families, tourists, local kids. Nearly 2,000 people took their seats. Laughter filled the arena. Vendors pushed snow cones. The ringmaster rehearsed his lines. Backstage, a quiet unease settled over a few staffers. Tyke had refused a maneuver during practice. Her ears were flared. Her tail swished low, subtle signs that seasoned trainers recognize as warnings. But there was no backup plan, no safety barrier, no tranquilizer team on standby. Just tradition, routine, and an unwavering belief that things would be fine. The announcer's voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the mighty elephants of Circus International." Spotlights swung to center ring. Tyke stepped into the arena. From the outside, it looked like business as usual, but behind Tyke's eyes, something was shifting. Allen raised his hand. The music swelled. She moved forward, but not with grace. Her steps were heavy, deliberate. She looked past the audience, past the lights, towards something only she seemed to see. This wasn't performance. It was pressure. And in that final moment of calm, as Allen signaled the beginning of the act, no one realized they were seconds away from catastrophe. It happened fast, but not without warning. 2:32 p.m. Tyke hesitated mid-performance. She was supposed to raise her front leg, a move she had done dozens of times before. Instead, she froze. Her ears stiffened, her eyes locked forward, her entire 9,000-pound frame tensed like a coiled spring. Allen Campbell moved toward her, speaking softly. A cue, a redirection. But Tyke was past listening. In an instant, she swung her trunk and slammed Dallas Beckwith to the ground. The crowd gasped. Some laughed at first, thinking it was part of the act. Then they saw the blood. Allen reacted instinctively. He rushed in, trying to pull Tyke's attention back to him. He shouted her name, raised his voice, extended his arm. One final command. Tyke turned and charged. She knocked Allen to the ground with brutal force. Then, in full view of hundreds of spectators, she trampled him. Once, twice, again. His white shirt turned red. Screams rippled through the arena. Parents grabbed children. Ushers began yelling for evacuation. The illusion of control shattered in an instant. Tyke didn't pause. She bellowed, an enraged, guttural sound, and ran off stage, toward the holding pens. Handlers scattered. Circus staff fumbled with gates. The elephants backstage panicked. Allen Campbell's body remained motionless in the ring. Dallas Beckwith, gravely injured, was carried out on a stretcher. He would survive, but with broken ribs, a punctured lung, and permanent trauma. Outside, police dispatch received the first call. "We have an elephant loose inside the arena. Trainer down. Crowd in panic." Inside, the Blaisdell Center descended into chaos. People tripped over seats trying to flee. Some thought there had been a gunshot. Others thought a bomb had gone off. It was confusion layered over horror. And at the center of it all, Tyke, covered in blood and foam, was now smashing her way toward freedom. But this wasn't freedom. It was escape. And for the next 30 minutes, the streets of Honolulu would bear witness to one of the most surreal and deadly animal incidents ever caught on film. Outside the Blaisdell Center, the day was deceptively calm. Palm trees swayed in the breeze. Tourists snapped photos. Local vendors sold shave ice just blocks from the arena. Then the ground trembled. Tyke exploded through the loading bay doors, her skin soaked in sweat and blood. Steel bars bent behind her. Handlers dove out of the way. She was no longer a performer. She was a force of nature unleashed. Witnesses described it as surreal, a full-grown African elephant charging into urban Honolulu traffic. She turned onto Ward Avenue. Drivers slammed brakes. Children screamed. A metro bus nearly collided with her as she barreled through an intersection. Sirens howled in the distance. Police were already en route, but they weren't prepared for this. This wasn't a contained arena. This was a living city. Apartment buildings, restaurants, cars backed up for blocks, pedestrians frozen in disbelief. Some people actually got out of their cars to watch, too shocked to realize the danger. One officer later described her eyes. They weren't wild. They were focused, determined, like she was trying to get somewhere. But Tyke didn't know where to go. She was acting on instinct, looking for escape, looking for space, running from everything she had ever been taught to endure. Police tried to corral her, firing warning shots into the air. It didn't work. Then they fired at her legs. That didn't work either. She charged a patrol car, dented its hood, and kept moving. At one point, she crossed Queen Street, shattering a traffic light. Residents peeked through blinds as she thundered past. Businesses locked their doors. Tyke ran for nearly 30 city blocks, nearly half an hour of chaos, while law enforcement scrambled to assemble a response worthy of something they'd never trained for. This wasn't just an animal on the loose. This was the unraveling of a myth. The myth that you can dominate the wild and suffer no consequences. The myth that fear makes animals obedient forever. The myth that breaking a creature's spirit won't come back to break your world. And now, all of Honolulu was watching that myth charge through their streets. From the moment Tyke exited the arena, the city had 30 minutes to respond. But those minutes didn't feel like a chase. They felt like a breakdown of order, of systems, of assumptions. Police quickly realized they were outmatched. Their weapons, mostly handguns and 12-gauge shotguns, weren't designed to stop a 9,000-pound elephant in motion. Their training had prepared them for active shooters, not rogue megafauna. And yet, every time Tyke lunged forward, someone had to act. They shot to protect the public. But it didn't stop her. Witnesses described the sound of gunfire ricocheting off bone. Officers fired in clusters, aiming for her legs and shoulders, trying to slow her down. But adrenaline kept her upright. In a city known for its beauty, peace, and tourism, the spectacle unfolding was something out of a war zone. Tyke struck multiple vehicles. She shattered a news van. She knocked over a fire hydrant, sending a geyser into the sky. Somewhere in the chaos, a photographer snapped a picture. Tyke standing mid-street, her trunk high, her eyes alert. That image would become iconic. Around the 30-minute mark, she turned onto Kapiolani Boulevard, staggering now, wounded, bleeding heavily. She reached a parking lot outside a nearby office building and collapsed against a low wall. Her legs folded. She tried to rise, couldn't. Then tried again. Police closed in. They fired over 80 more rounds, mostly at close range. Some officers wept as they pulled the trigger. This wasn't just an act of public safety. It was an execution, but no one knew what else to do. By the time she finally stopped moving, Tyke had been shot over 85 times. Her body lay in a pool of blood, half-curled, trunk motionless. Children who had seen her hours earlier waving to the crowd now asked their parents if the elephant had been bad. But Tyke hadn't been bad. She had been broken. And when she ran, she didn't just run through the streets of Honolulu. She ran straight through the heart of a centuries-old industry built on silence, spectacle, and suffering. When the final shot rang out, the city fell silent. Tyke was dead. Allen Campbell was dead. Dallas Beckwith was in the hospital. And the crowd that had gathered outside the Blaisdell Center now stood in a stunned hush, unsure whether they'd just witnessed a tragedy or a reckoning. By nightfall, the media descended. Footage of Tyke's rampage, captured by local news helicopters and bystanders, made international headlines. One image, in particular, circulated everywhere. Tyke lying in the parking lot, her massive body surrounded by spent shell casings and flashing lights. It was haunting, not just because of the violence, but because it exposed something the public hadn't wanted to see: the cost of entertainment. Press coverage was immediate and relentless. Local outlets interviewed witnesses, many of them children, who described the horror inside the tent. Some cried on camera, others spoke in disbelief. It was like watching a monster movie, but it was real. Police were praised for preventing further casualties, but even officers privately admitted they had never faced anything like it. One sergeant called the shooting the worst day of his career, but the biggest shift wasn't emotional. It was institutional. Animal rights groups mobilized overnight. PETA released a statement within hours, calling Tyke's death the inevitable result of confinement and cruelty. The ASPCA, Born Free Foundation, and In Defense of Animals demanded immediate legislation banning wild animals in circuses. They held up Tyke's story as proof that captivity doesn't just harm animals, it endangers people. Public trust in the circus industry began to erode. Protesters lined up outside future circus shows with signs reading, "Remember Tyke." Parents reconsidered what they thought was family entertainment. Politicians in Hawaii floated proposals to ban exotic animals in public performances, bills that would later influence broader federal discussions. And the Hawthorne Corporation, which had managed Tyke, came under intense scrutiny. Investigations revealed a long list of violations, neglected reports, and repeated warnings, many of which had gone unanswered. Tyke's death wasn't just a footnote, it was a flashpoint. And in the echo of gunfire and headlines, a bigger question emerged. What did we ignore for this to happen? 2 funerals followed that August afternoon. One held in a hospital morgue, the other in the streets. Allen Campbell's body was returned to his family days after the incident. His injuries had been catastrophic, his rib cage crushed, his skull fractured. He was pronounced dead at the scene. But for many who knew him, the real pain came later, trying to reconcile the man they loved with the way he died. Allen was a husband, a father, a lifelong animal handler whose passion for elephants had begun in his teens. He had worked with dozens of elephants in his career, and despite the trauma of his final moments, his family remembered him not as a victim, but as a man who believed deeply in connection between humans and animals. His ashes were scattered in Florida. His name was added to a memorial wall honoring circus performers who died in the line of duty. But Allen wasn't the only one mourned. Across animal welfare communities, Tyke became a symbol, a victim of human failure and institutional neglect. Vigils were held in her name in cities around the world. Activists laid flowers outside the Blaisdell Center. In some demonstrations, protesters dressed in gray and painted their faces to resemble her, standing silently for hours as onlookers passed. Even in death, she remained controversial. Some saw a killer. Others saw a captive push past her limits. But few could deny the emotional weight her death carried. In the weeks that followed, letters poured into newsrooms and government offices, some angry, others pleading. One letter read, "I took my child to see elephants perform. I thought it was magic. Now I see it was misery." Teachers used the incident as a talking point in classrooms. Ethics professors referenced it in lectures. Tyke had not just escaped the circus. She had pierced the collective blind spot society held toward performing animals. Mourning, in this case, wasn't just about loss. It was about reckoning with how much suffering went unseen until it exploded into violence. And in the shadow of that dual tragedy, a question lingered like smoke. Who do we grieve more? The man who believed in control, or the elephant who never had any? Tyke's rampage didn't just shatter bones and lives, it shattered illusions. In the months that followed, the circus industry found itself under a microscope. Journalists dug deep. Legislators began asking uncomfortable questions. And for the first time in decades, the conversation wasn't about showmanship. It was about suffering. The Hawthorne Corporation, which had leased Tyke for the Honolulu performance, became a lightning rod. Inspections revealed years of USDA violations, improper care, abusive handling methods, failure to provide adequate space or enrichment. Over time, it came to light that Tyke was not an outlier, but a symptom of a broken system. In 2004, 10 years after her death, the U.S. Department of Agriculture took decisive action. It revoked Hawthorne's license and ordered the surrender of its remaining 16 elephants, citing chronic violations of the Animal Welfare Act. The elephants were sent to sanctuaries. Some arrived with scars, some with behavioral disorders that never healed. Meanwhile, public perception of circuses began to shift. Local governments across the United States started enacting bans on wild animal acts, citing Tyke as the catalyst. San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York City. Then entire countries joined in. Austria, Bolivia, Israel, and others passed legislation banning or severely restricting the use of animals in circuses. Even Ringling Bros, once the crown jewel of American circus culture, felt the pressure. In 2016, After years of protests and lawsuits, they announced they would retire all their elephants. By 2017, the circus itself closed permanently. The domino effect started with Tyke, not because she was the first elephant to fight back, but because this time, the world was watching, with cameras, with questions, and finally, with conscience. Her story was retold in books, on television, in classrooms. Documentaries such as Tyke, Elephant Outlaw, and An Apology to Elephants explored the deep ethical failures of using wild animals for entertainment. Former trainers came forward. Former supporters changed sides. Tyke didn't live to see a better world, but her death helped create one. And in the silence that followed the last gunshot, the circus industry was no longer judged by its sparkle, but by its shadows. The aftermath of Tyke's death didn't just challenge how circuses operated. It challenged their very right to exist. For over a century, animal performances were a staple of global entertainment. Children gasped as lions leapt through rings of fire. Audiences cheered as elephants stood on stools or danced in formation. It felt magical, harmless, even awe-inspiring. But behind the velvet curtains and glittering costumes, a darker reality had always been present, one of chains, punishment, and psychological fracture. Elephants, in particular, are not easy to train. They are intelligent, social, and profoundly emotional animals. In the wild, they live in matriarchal herds, form lifelong bonds, and walk dozens of miles a day. In circuses, they are confined, often isolated, and subjected to tools like bullhooks, sharp metal instruments used to coerce obedience. Many animal behaviorists now argue that performance is not training, it's submission. What looks like cooperation is often fear, and the emotional toll is visible. Elephants in captivity display symptoms of zoochosis, a repetitive neurotic behavior marked by swaying, pacing, or self-harm. These are not signs of contentment, they are the echoes of unresolved trauma. So when we ask, should animals perform? We're not asking about tradition. We're asking about ethics, about consent, about whether it's morally defensible to force wild creatures into lives of confinement for the sake of a fleeting applause. Supporters argue that modern circuses can be ethical, that with improved welfare standards, animals can thrive, that it's educational, that it fosters appreciation. But critics respond with a simple truth. Real appreciation doesn't require domination. In recent years, the industry has begun to adapt. Some circuses have gone animal-free, using acrobatics, puppetry, and light shows to entertain without harm. These companies are thriving, proof that wonder doesn't have to come at a cost. But the shadows of the past remain. And Tyke's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. We didn't just watch animals perform. We watched them endure. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, the question lingers. Not just in courtrooms or protest signs, but in the conscience of anyone who ever bought a ticket. What else did we applaud, without understanding what it took? After Tyke's death, the world looked different. For the first time, conversations about animal rights entered the mainstream. What was once a fringe concern, dismissed as radical or overly sentimental, now took on urgency. Images of Tyke's blood-soaked body, collapsed in the middle of a Honolulu street, had shattered the narrative that animals in circuses were happy performers. But reform didn't come easily. The circus industry pushed back. Powerful lobbying groups insisted that animal training was rooted in tradition, that it was safe, that incidents like Tyke's were rare. Some claimed activists were trying to destroy jobs, not protect animals. In courtrooms and public hearings, defenders of the circus insisted they loved their animals, even as records showed patterns of neglect and abuse. And for years, reform efforts stalled. Legislation aimed at banning animal acts was introduced, but often died in committee. Some cities passed ordinances, others didn't. Some circuses phased out elephant acts, others doubled down. Change was slow, uneven, painful, but it came. In 2017, Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, once called the greatest show on earth, shut down after 146 years in operation. Declining ticket sales, mounting legal pressure, changing public sentiment. The end wasn't immediate. It was cumulative. And Tyke's ghost was part of that reckoning. Today, more than 50 countries have full or partial bans on the use of wild animals in circuses. Cities across the US have joined in. from Los Angeles to New York. And organizations once seen as radical, like the Humane Society and Animal Defenders International, now work with lawmakers to create enforceable animal welfare policies. Meanwhile, sanctuaries have emerged as alternatives, spaces where formerly captive elephants live out the rest of their lives in peace, away from the spotlight. Some of these elephants still bear scars, some never recover. But at least they are no longer props. The struggle continues, but the momentum has shifted. Because Tyke didn't just charge through a circus ring, she charged through decades of denial. And in the space she left behind, something new began to grow. Not just outrage, but responsibility. The name Tyke was once printed in bold letters on a circus program. Now, it's etched into a deeper part of our cultural memory. Over the years, Tyke's story has become more than a headline or a cautionary tale. It has become a symbol of captivity, of rebellion, of the moment when silence gave way to screams. In the decades since her death, activists around the world have marched under banners bearing her name. Justice for Tyke signs have appeared at City Hall protests, school petitions, and circus demonstrations in countries she never set foot in. Even those who never saw the footage still know the name. Because it means something now. Tyke has appeared in books, investigative reports, and university studies on animal cognition and trauma. She has been the subject of films, including the chilling documentary Tyke Elephant Outlaw, which exposed not just her final moments, but the system that created them. The film doesn't sensationalize her rampage. It mourns it. In classrooms, she is taught not as a monster, but as a case study in ethics. In sanctuaries, some rescued elephants are named in her honor. In art, her likeness is reimagined. Not wearing makeup, not balancing on a stool, but standing tall and wild and free. Her name carries weight. For trainers who left the industry, it's the story that changed their path. For lawmakers, it's the name they cite when introducing bans. For children raised to question what's normal, Tyke is a reminder that entertainment should never come at the cost of another creature's freedom. And yet, the legacy is complicated. Tyke did kill a man. She injured another. She rampaged through a city. Her story is not without horror, but neither is it without humanity. Because in her defiance, people didn't just see rage, they saw grief, they saw confusion, they saw something deeply, painfully familiar. Tyke became a mirror, one that showed us how far we were willing to go to maintain an illusion, and how fast that illusion could shatter. Today, the name Tyke doesn't just represent what happened. It represents what we finally decided could never happen again. The story of Allen Campbell and Tyke isn't just about a circus gone wrong. It's about the cost of control and the consequences of ignoring suffering dressed up as spectacle. Tyke wasn't a villain. She was a captive. Trained, restrained, pushed to the brink. Allen wasn't reckless. He was a believer. Someone who thought trust and discipline were enough to keep danger at bay. But that day shattered both illusions. It forced us to stop pretending that wild animals can be tamed without consequence, or that tradition justifies torment. Tyke's death changed the world. Not because it was the first incident, but because it was finally the one we couldn't look away from. It became a turning point, and a warning. If this story made you pause, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Ask the hard questions. What else have we applauded without understanding the price? Because stories like Tyke's don't disappear. They echo until someone listens. If you believe this story matters, please like, share, and subscribe. These voices deserve to be heard. It was supposed to be just another show. A humid Saturday afternoon in Honolulu. Hundreds of families filed into the Neil Blaisdell Center for the Circus International, expecting wonder, laughter, and the thrill of the exotic. Children clutched popcorn. Parents checked their watches. The program promised a parade of tigers, clowns, and elephants. For many, the highlight would be Tyke, an enormous African elephant billed as the gentle giant. She'd been trained to bow, dance, and raise her trunk to the roar of applause. What the audience didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that beneath the makeup, beneath the illusion of harmony between man and animal, something had been unraveling for years. Because no matter how many routines Tyke had rehearsed, she was still a wild animal. No matter how many performances she completed without, and no matter how seasoned Allen Campbell was, No matter how much he believed in discipline, compassion, or expertise, he was still human, still breakable. This is the paradox of the circus, the presentation of total control in a setting built on tension. An elephant doesn't perform because it loves to. It performs because it's been made to. With repetition, with discipline, with pain when necessary. But what happens when that control fails? What happens when the audience sees not the illusion, but the truth? That's what this story is about. Not just a death, not just a rampage, but the slow, invisible fracture of trust between man and animal, stage and spectator, reality and performance. In that arena, people came to see a miracle, but what they witnessed instead was a system coming apart in real time. This wasn't chaos out of nowhere, it was consequence. And it's important we understand that, because when an animal finally snaps, the damage doesn't begin in that moment, it begins long before. In every decision, every warning ignored, every dollar made at the cost of silence. He wasn't alone. The industry believed it too, until 2:32 p.m., and by then it was far too late.